All right, let's journey back in time. We're heading to the year 1009 in China, right in the middle of the Song dynasty. And we're diving into a historical mystery, a construction project so big and so, well, weird that it just begs for an explanation. Okay, let's just get straight to the heart of it. The emperor at the time, Zhenzong, commands his people to build this absolutely enormous palace, the Yuqing Ziyong Palace. So what's it for? To house the imperial court? To garrison an army? Nope. It was built to hold a single piece of paper, a document they called the Heavenly Book. And when I say enormous, I mean it. The complex sprawled across 350,000 square meters. That's over 86 acres. Just try to picture that. It's a staggering amount of land, especially when you remember why they were building it. And this is where it just gets mind-bending. You've probably heard of the Forbidden City in Beijing, right? A city within a city built to house the entire imperial government, the whole shebang. Well, this palace was about half the size of that. But it was all for just one thing. It's an extravagance that just doesn't seem to make any sense.
So let's talk about the sheer logistics of this thing. The cost was so high that records just say it was countless. And a project that should have taken 15 years to build was somehow rushed to completion in just over 6. That kind of speed, that kind of urgency, it really makes you wonder what was going on.
Now, you'd think a project this huge, draining this many resources, would have made the common people furious. You'd expect protests, maybe even revolts. But that's not what happened. The people actually supported it. So how on earth is that possible?
Well, the answer is pretty clever, actually. It's all about how this Song dynasty did things. See, they didn't use forced peasant labor like a lot of other dynasties. Instead, they used their professional army for big building projects. These weren't poor farmers being dragged away from their crops. These were paid soldiers. This meant the crucial farming seasons weren't interrupted, and the workers were actually making money. They even got regular bonuses from the emperor. On top of all that, the whole thing was framed as a holy mission, a job for heaven itself. So working on the palace wasn't a punishment. It was a good-paying, respectable gig. And don't just take my word for it. A writer from the Southern Song period, Hang Mai, looked back on this whole event and noted the same thing. He thought the palace was ridiculously extravagant, for sure, but he also pointed out that because the emperor wasn't starting wars or hitting people with harsh laws, everybody was surprisingly okay with it. Okay, so the people are happy. But what about the scholar officials? These were the guys whose entire job was to uphold Confucian values. You know, things like being frugal and caring for the people. They were famous for speaking their minds. So where were they? Why didn't they try to stop this madness? And this really lays out the conflict perfectly. On one side, you have the official's sacred duty, but on the other, the emperor had the ultimate trump card. When his own chief minister tried to gently protest about the cost, the emperor's answer was basically unblockable. I'm building this temple to pray for a son. In a culture where having an heir to the throne was everything, what could they possibly say to that? It was a checkmate. But that excuse about needing an heir? That was just what was on the surface. The real reason, the deep-down driver, was that Emperor Zhenzong was facing a massive legitimacy crisis. The Song dynasty hadn't come to power in the usual way, through some epic rebellion that gave them a clear mandate of heaven. They had to prove they deserved to rule. They had to create the appearance of a golden age. So how do you do that? Well, you pull out the playbook from the last great golden age, the Tang dynasty, and Zhenzong followed it to a T. He performed the same grand rituals, he worshipped at the same holy sites, he even cooked up a divine ancestor for his family, just like the Tang emperors had. This impossible palace wasn't just a building, it was the crown jewel of this massive political performance. This brings us to a really fascinating part of the story. It's one thing to start a project like this for political reasons, but why do they so often spiral completely out of control? Why is it so hard for leaders, then and now, to just stop once they've started down a path like this? A big part of the answer is something called cognitive dissonance. It's that really uncomfortable mental static you feel when you do something that goes against what you believe about yourself. And to get rid of that feeling, you don't usually change your behavior. Oh no, you rationalize it. You invent new reasons to make it all seem okay. And there's a perfect little story about this from Zhenzong's court. So remember, the whole project is based on this giant lie about the Heavenly Book. Then one day, an official brings him a report that mentions 2 cranes appeared, a minor detail slightly exaggerated.
The emperor makes a big show of ordering them to correct it, saying it wasn't 100% true. And what happens? His minister immediately praises him for being so incredibly honest. So by fixing this tiny little fib, the emperor, who told a world-changing lie, gets to tell himself, see, I'm a really honest guy. It's incredible. But it wasn't just what was going on in the emperor's head. Once these things get going, they develop what you might call system momentum. The project starts to feed itself. Building all these new temples, for example, created a whole new set of government jobs. It was a convenient way to park officials you didn't want around but still had to pay. And once all those jobs and all those interests exist, the system itself has a reason to keep the project going, making it almost impossible to shut down. So, what finally happened to this impossible palace, this monument to political anxiety and self-deception? Well, its ending was just as dramatic and just as ironic as its creation. So the palace is finished in 1014. A mere 15 years later, it gets struck by lightning and burns to the ground. An official saw the Empress Regent weeping over the ruins and coldly told her it would have been better if it had all burned, meaning if it hadn't, they'd just be tempted to waste money rebuilding it. But they didn't learn. A century later, a new emperor, Huizong, built an even more extravagant complex called the Genwei. It was finished just 5 years before the entire Northern Song dynasty collapsed. This whole tragic, repeating cycle calls to mind a famous line from the poet Du Mu, written centuries before about the folly of another emperor. Later generations mourned them, but did not learn from them, causing even later generations to mourn them in turn. It's such a profound and timeless warning, isn't it? These massive projects, they're not just about one person's ego. They're about this complex dance between psychology, politics, and the momentum of a system. And the question it really leaves you with is, have we, today, truly learned that lesson?